Welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions, everyone. I'm Tim Derling, and I have a very, very special guest I'm speaking with today, author Greg Prato. Hello, Greg.
Hey Tim, how you doing?
I'm doing really good. Greg has written several music-based books, and chances are somebody out there watching has some of Greg's books. If you're a Kiss fan, I do want to point out two of the best ones because they deal with subjects that official Kiss books don't tend to. Are Take It Off, Kiss Truly Unmasked. It deals with Kiss in the 80s. And of course, the Eric Carr story. Similar time period, but yeah, parts of history that often don't get talked about. But the reason I've got Greg here today is we're going to be talking about his latest book, World Infestation, the RATT Story. I've got such a soft spot for RATT. I've listened to them a lot lately, getting ready for this, and I don't know. There's something about that band. I just keep coming back to them. First of all, I want to say I love the cover. As soon as I saw this, I'm thinking this.
That
That's
was
got to have
that
been
that was
on
what I
purpose.
modeled it
Yeah,
after. Exactly. Good
little
eye.
little nod
Good
to the
eye.
dancing on the cover. So, so Greg, what led you to cover RATT for your latest book? Why RATT?
Well, over the years, I interviewed all of the surviving members. The only Rat member I've never interviewed was the late Robin Crosby. I've done multiple interviews actually with most of them. I did in the early 2000s for Classic Rock magazine a feature about Rat's whole entire career. And then over the years, I interviewed Warren for another book I did about MTV called MTV Ruled the World. Then they just put out the box set about a year ago, and I did another interview with Steven and another interview with Juan. And I just realized after doing all these interviews that I had several ways I could do a book because of all these quotes from these interviews I did with them over the years. It really covered the whole entire story. And then I went back and found some great old quotes from Circus Magazine's Hit Parade or Kerrang! And then also I got in contact with Mitch LaFon, who conducted one of the last ever interviews with Robin Crosby, just I think several months before he passed away, sadly. And yeah, and then I was able to get in contact with some great photographers who, like you just pointed out, the cover was from Christopher Lee Helton. He took a great photo. Yep, yep, there you go. That's a great shot of the Dancing Undercover tour. So yeah, I just
What I like about
realized,
these, each one of those is it says where they're taken, where they're from. I
yeah,
like that.
exactly. Yep, yep, all vintage pictures. Yeah, so basically from all that, I just realized I had a good start to do a book. And Rat, I know that two members have previously put out their own books, Bobby Blotzer and also Stephen Piercy. But I wanted to do a book that told the whole story, not just from their point of views. So yeah, that's how I wound up doing World Infestation. And that title comes from a shirt they used to have that said World Infestation on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important to get the balanced version of the story because Steven's going to tell it from his perspective, and Blotz is going to tell it from his perspective, and if Juan ever did a book, um, it's um, it's interesting because Rat I think is a band that, and this is talked about in your book, that I think gets classified somewhat unfairly. I mean, the truth of the matter is that Round and Round was their one really really big hit, but they sold a lot of albums in the 80s and they did some big tours and they're up there in that echelon of bands. And I think people are coming around to realize that there was a lot more to Rat than Round and Round and Out of the Cellar.
Right. Yeah, people tend to forget that for about a 1 or 2 year period, they were definitely one of the top heavy metal hard rock bands in all of America. They were so big in 1985 that Bon Jovi opened for them on a arena headlining tour. And yeah, in 1985 was on the Castle Donington Monsters of Rock. They were above Metallica on the bill. They were also, again, they played with Metallica on the Day on the Green. And again, they were above Yngwie Malmsteen, Metallica, maybe one or two other bands, I forget.
I think Y
But
and
yeah,
T, Scorpions were on that bill
yeah,
too.
Scorpions headlined that, and then over at Castle Donington, ZZ Top headlined that. So they were playing with like the biggest bands. MTV was constantly playing them. Yeah, even in 1984, Out of the Cellar outsold Shout at the Devil and also charted higher than Shout at the Devil. And even Rat had a legitimate hit single with the song Round and Round, whereas the closest Motley Crue came was Looks That Kill, that I don't think he even cracked the top 40. So for a
Yeah.
brief period, you could say Ratt was even bigger than Motley Crue. Just the only difference is Motley Crue had longer career, or as far as, or they had albums that seemed to outsell each other, whereas Ratt may have peaked in 84, 85, then each album sold less and less and less.
Yeah. Yeah, they did all right. I mean, yeah, they didn't stick around long enough. I mean, they didn't have their Dr. Feelgood moment that brought them, back up into the multi-millions. They only did it one
Yeah.
time. But
And also, I was going
consistent.
to add to like one criticism of Rat too is as their albums went on, more and more of their albums contain more filler. I think their EP and also Out of the Cellar were pretty much fillerless. They were both pretty consistent from front to back. Then as the albums go on, then yeah, it tends to get like there were certain albums like the whole second side would be clearly not as good as the first side. And even like there's quotes from Bobby Blotzer in the book where there's one album, I think it was Dancing Undercover, that he said the whole second side he can't really listen to, which I actually disagree with him because the last song on that album I think is one of their best songs.
I actually really like Dancing Undercover, but I do understand yeah, Out of the Cellar was that lightning in a bottle moment where every single song was just a complete killer. I do want to talk about the EP for a second because the EP I've always been intrigued by it. Number one, I love it. I
Mhm.
think it's a fantastic collection.
No,
It never
that's actually
seems to
my
get.
favorite Rat release is probably the EP.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah,
As funny as that sounds, it's not that I
yeah,
don't like the other albums. It's just that percentage wise, every second of space on that EP is just excellent. And it
yeah.
never seems to get reissued. I don't understand why it didn't come out as part of that big box set. And the only thing I've ever been able to figure is that maybe they don't have the rights to it.
Yeah, I actually asked Juan that same question. I asked why, and he didn't say that. He didn't say they don't have the rights. Just he said they just wanted to focus on the full lengths or the whole entire Atlantic years. But there's a bit of a hole in that theory because as most Rat fans know, that EP was issued or reissued on Atlantic in 1984. So it really should have been included. And the reason why I like that EP so much is it's very raw and rocking. I know that Robin Crosby throughout the book several times talks about how that was how he always heard Rat or wanted Rat to sound. As the albums went on, it seemed like that the productions got glossier and glossier. I think Rat would have been better off with a much more raw rocking sound, because they talk about their big influences were bands like Aerosmith, early Van Halen, and the thing that made those bands so great, especially their early albums in the 70s, was that it was the sound of a real live raw rocking band. And yeah, I just think that Rat should have maybe had maybe like a more of a raw rocking sound to their albums.
Yeah, I mean, I think people would be surprised if they've never heard all of it, how heavy that EP is with Sweet Cheater and You Got It. And I've always preferred that original version of Back for More. I love their cover of Walking the Dog, and
Yeah.
it's probably one of the rare CDs in my collection. I found an Atlantic CD of it, but you
Oh wow.
never see it out there.
I was
And
gonna say I don't think I've ever seen a CD of that in my whole entire life.
yeah, you can get them like
That is a rare one,
you
yeah.
can go online and find used copies, but that's what you're paying a lot, and you're paying for a used CD. So I
Right.
don't know. I've always wondered if whoever Marshall Burl or Time Coast, if they
Right.
have more of a say in it, and Atlantic licensed it from them, but only for a short period of time because that EP went out of print, and I've never really understood. It's so good, so I have to
I
wonder,
agree.
like, that I would have thought that if it was just straight up owned by Atlantic, they just put out whatever they did. You raised an
Yeah.
interesting point, um, Greg, with the Ratt Roll 8191 compilation, which is probably the easiest thing you can find out there for a single disc by Ratt. You can probably still find Out of the Cellar too, but there's an awful lot of Detonator
Yeah.
on Ratt Roll 8191. I've always wondered, do you think Atlantic were trying to push Detonator a little bit because it had only been out for a year? And I think, if I recall correctly, by the time that Ratt and Roll 8191 came out, Detonator was already in the cutout bins or the delete bins with the chunk cut into it.
Yeah, 100%. I think you're right that maybe they wanted to possibly rekindle sales, maybe hoping that one of the tracks would catch on or something like that with radio. But yeah, it didn't, and that's by far I think their weakest album. I know there are some Rat fans that do have a soft spot for that album, but that's That's actually the only Rat album from that original run that I did not own. That's at that point I'd kind of lost interest. Listening back to it now, I could see that it had potential. And I know going into it, their whole thing was they wanted to actually return to that raw rocking EP type sound, but then they got Desmond Child, who, I appreciate Desmond Child, but Desmond Child isn't someone that you'd want to turn to if you want like a raw rocking type sound. If you want
Oh,
more of like a pop polish thing, you go to
you go to
Desmond Child.
Desmond Child if you want to Slippery When Wet or
Exactly.
Trash or
Yep.
Permanent
Exactly.
Vacation. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly.
Something I've always found interesting, and then there's a lot of talk about the book in it, is Stephen Pearcy as a vocalist. Stephen Pearcy is never someone that I would call a singer's singer, but in Rat, he was just the right guy. But I guess from reading it, like Beau Hill talks about it, they had a certain way of capturing him in the studio.
Yeah, there's one thing that I feel, I think I may even talk, I'm sure I mentioned this in the book, is it seems like two people from the glam metal, hair metal 80s tend to get a lot of flack is Stephen Pearcy with his vocals and also Mick Mars with guitar. And I personally could never understand that because my favorite type vocals, I love Freddie Mercury, I love Ronnie James Dio, I love the great technical singers, but I've always been a fan of singers that you hear a second or a few seconds of them and you know exactly who it is and their personality comes out and it's unique and it sounds totally like them. I'm thinking singers like Alice Cooper, Mick Jagger, Joey Ramone. And I think Stephen Pearcy absolutely fit Rat's music perfectly. So I don't know why he got such flack. I mean, I think Robin Crosby in the book talks about, oh, sometimes live he would have trouble staying in key, but I listened to live recordings of it and I think he sounds fine. And the thing with also Mick Mars, I think his guitar playing fit Motley Crue perfectly. I
Oh
think
yeah,
he may have gotten some flack from in the 80s. I'm sure you probably remember when you go to these big arena rock shows, there was a thing for a while that every single member in the band would have a 5 or 10 minute unaccompanied solo. And, certain guys, to listen to 5 or 10 minutes of a bass player or a drummer, that was famous. People would say, oh, that's the time you go to buy your t-shirt to go to use the bathroom. And, Mick Mars' guitar playing works fantastic. I think in Motley Crue songs, maybe not so much when you're watching 5 or 10 minutes of him playing a solo all by himself inside an arena. That's only my thought about that.
yeah. I think Mick's, as much as anything, Mick was part of the reason that made them unique because he had that tone that was can't really reproduce it. I've heard plenty of people cover Motley Crue and it never sounds quite right.
That's true, and I'm always a fan of guitarists that you could sing their solos rather
Yep,
than shredding 1,000 mile per hour type things. And he's definitely one of those guitarists that you could, that his solos are very melodic, and you can usually sing along with them.
yeah, and he was a little older, so I think that has a lot to do with it. He had more of a '70s mentality. But
Yeah,
back to Ratt, I mean, obviously Ratt had one of the most talented lead players of the '80s in Warren DeMartini, and I think that if you talk to a lot of he wouldn't always get the mentions. But I think if you
mm,
talk to a lot of guys even today that were around then, they would say, "Oh yeah, Warren definitely." And Robin to a certain extent, but Robin was such a personality. He stood out in the crowd. He was so tall. He just had this
right.
imposing personality. And I remember reading that interview that Mitch did with Robin online back in the day. It was heartbreaking. It was a very, very tragic and a very cautionary tale, and it's a wonder there aren't more of those with the bands that came out of that scene because nobody was being careful about anything.
Right. That's true. And what's sad too is with doing these interviews for the book and doing research, I didn't find one single person saying one bad thing about Robin. He was really well liked. I know that they say he was a sweetheart of a person. Yeah, like what's sad is he talks about when he was being interviewed by Mitch, and it's also in my book, that he couldn't understand towards the end. He lost all his money. He was almost like homeless. And he was talking about how, oh, I reached out to all my former members in Rat, and I also reached out to Nikki Sixx, who he was also close with, and they wouldn't give me any money. I needed money. And it's, for me as an outsider looking in, it was obvious why they weren't giving him money because they were
They
concerned for his health and they knew it would go right into his drug habit. But it's sad, I guess, at that point, he was just so far gone that he couldn't see that, maybe.
It's kind of surprising because yeah, the Rat guys and the Motley guys were always close.
Mm,
You'd always see pictures of some combination of the two bands in
yeah.
Circus and Hit Parader and Metal
Mm.
Edge. It's a wonder Nicky didn't, I don't know, take him in even, or put him in a place where he would be watched and made sure that no dealers got to him or anything. But we don't know the story there, right? There
Right.
was some interesting parts of the book, like you said. Uh, Rat headlined over Bon Jovi, over Poison, over Queensryche, like bands that would go on to headline in their own right. And, they were just big arena packing band. Um, that I found was interesting because you can't talk about Rat without talking about Beau Hill because as a producer and as a figure in their career, he weighs in so heavily. Even though he likes to say they fired him every time and had to hire him back, so he actually made more money. But it seems like they were a pretty dysfunctional bunch. But I
Yeah.
didn't know that Beau Hill got a lot of advice from Bruce Fairbairn at the start of his production career. That was something interesting. I wouldn't have thought those two would cross paths, but I guess Bruce produced the Airborne album
Yes.
that
Yeah.
Beau was a
Yeah.
member of. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what
Um,
they talk about. And then also something else I just wanted to bring up too, that for this book, I did a new interview with Bunny Carlos, the original drummer for the band Cheap Trick. And that's also a band that's, you think of it now, Cheap Trick is such a respected band. They're still out there playing pretty decent sized places. They're also in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And there was a period, 1986, that Ratt was bigger enough, that were bigger than Cheap Trick enough that they were able to, Ratt was headlining Madison Square Garden, they were headlining arenas, and Cheap Trick was actually below them. And actually Bun has some very good stories and also memories about that time as well in the book.
yeah, a lot of great quotes from Bun in there, and yeah, it's really interesting because Cheap Trick is such an interesting case of a band that sold millions and millions of albums, but had such peaks and valleys in their career, and it seems like they were never ever to maintain that arena status for very very long. They hit big with Budokan and Dream
Mhm.
Police, but they very slacked off. Most of the '80s, they were practically you could go see them just about anywhere, like the smallest
Right.
of places or like you said, opening for newer bands that were headlining. And until the Flame was a number one song, but even then it didn't last that long. And they've
Yeah,
they've opened for Def Leppard, they've opened for
it seemed like after Kurt Cobain went on record saying he was a big Cheap Trick fan, and like some of also the other grunge bands voiced their admiration, and also Smashing Pumpkins said they were
oh
big
yeah
Cheap Trick
yeah
fans in the early '90s. That's when I think people realized that Cheap Trick was truly a great band, and now they're looked upon as one of the greats.
that's kind of the neat thing about them. I know we're getting off track from Rat, but they were the type of band that could fit in opening for just about anybody because they had
Right.
elements of just about all that music. But yeah, in 1986, I mean, they were on the Doctor, and that was a
Yeah.
bomb of an album. So yeah,
Right.
I'm sure
Yeah.
they were probably glad to get in front of arenas, but they also, the crowd had the bonus of seeing a seasoned act open for them, and unfortunately, it never translated into sales. But something else that's interesting, and this happens a lot of times when you have new interviews mixed with old interviews, is the contradictions.
Mhm.
1985, what Juan Croucier has to say about something might not be what Juan had to say 4 years ago. And I like the fact that they're presented as they were. And you say, 20 years later, it was a different story. Um,
Mhm.
as a fan,
Mhm.
was there anything that you discovered in doing your research for this book or talking to any of the guys that really surprised you, or was it pretty much, oh yeah, I knew about that?
I mean, I kind of knew it, but one of the people I pretty much knew everything already for because especially back in the '80s, people that are younger watching this, really the way that you learned about bands is you either watched MTV or you picked up magazines like Circus and also Hit Parader, Kerrang, those types of. So I mean, I was always reading about these bands, so I was pretty familiar with Rat's whole entire history, especially in the 84, 85 period. Ratt was on almost every single cover of Circus and Hit Parader, so they were probably one of the most heavily covered bands. But for this book, I interviewed Ricky Rackman, who was the former co-host of MTV's Headbangers Ball, and he brought up a good point that I didn't think until I mean, I didn't cross my mind until he said this, that it's a shame that Ratt can't put aside their differences because when Motley Crue and Def Leppard did that stadium tour, Ratt really should have been included. That it would have made more sense for Ratt to be in it rather than Joan Jett. And
Yeah,
I'm a huge Joan Jett fan, but Joan Jett was never really like I never think of Joan Jett with like hair metal. or
Yeah.
glam metal. Whereas Rat, for a period, they had just as many, or still, if you look back at the amount of radio and also MTV hits, Rat had just almost just as many as Motley Crue. I mean, Def Leppard probably had bigger hits, but Rat, I think that would, if it was Def Leppard, Motley Crue, Poison, Rat, that would have been, I think, the ultimate. That's what it should have been, and that's what also Ricky mentioned. And I definitely have to agree with him with that.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that Rat put like a dozen songs in the top 100.
Hmm.
Not they only had two songs that cracked the top 40, but they had a lot of songs that would have gotten a lot of airplay on mainstream rock charts. And it is a shame, and it does kind of make you wonder because plenty of bands are dysfunctional. Aerosmith is dysfunctional. The Eagles, Motley Crue,
Right.
all the drama with Mick.
Hmm.
But one way or another, it's like they see the greater good or they see the payday at the end of it and they get over themselves. And it is kind of surprising. Like it makes you wonder if they don't think nobody's written them a big enough paycheck. Or Skid Row, there's another good example. They, getting back together with Sebastian, but nobody's written them a big enough paycheck, or they themselves don't think that they're going to draw that much because that seems to be a good motivator to at least give it a try to. So it makes you wonder, does the animosity really run that deep? And if so, what is it about? Because it doesn't seem like any one thing happened that drove wedges in between these band members.
When you think grown men should be able to just put aside their differences, the only thing I can think of is maybe at this point, if it's more than one manager involved, it's a bunch of managers and it's difficult to get everyone on one same page. I mean, it's probably easier if everyone just agrees to be represented by one manager and probably split it evenly. When you have different managers working out and someone's making more money than someone else, then maybe like, animosity starts. And then like I just recently interviewed Ian Pace, the classic drummer from the band Deep Purple, and I asked him we were talking about the recording of Machine Head, and I asked him, could you tell at that point when you were recording Machine Head, were there any cracks in the armor or anything? And he says, no, at that point you couldn't, but later things get said that can't be unsaid, and then it just ruins it. And I guess, if you say things that you can't take back, and then it's always in the back of your mind and animosity, and it's just kind of hard sometimes to put water under the bridge.
And the sad thing is that, Rat for a while became one of those bands there were multiple versions. There's Bobby Blotzer's Rat. There's Juan Crochet's Rat. There's Stephen Pearcy's Rat. Um, and it's kind of sad because there's a market out there. Their songs continue to resonate. I mean, Round and Round, when you think back, that's a pretty heavy song to go all the way to number 12 on the
Yeah.
Billboard pop chart. That just shows you how they were capable of reaching such a mass audience. And it was in that Geico commercial. It had another
Yeah.
life there.
Right.
They could have capitalized on these things, yeah, especially with the box set coming out. And there comes a time when there's a peak where if you haven't done it by then, the excitement's only going to be diminishing returns. I guess the best thing I can say is that, yeah, their albums do have a little bit of filler, but every one of their albums, they've never done a slang. They've never done they've never taken a real left turn and not sounded like themselves. That my least favorite Rat album is probably the self-titled one from '99.
Right.
It's a bit of an identity crisis there. I really like the collage thing that they put out with those leftover songs. I thought that had some strong songs. I thought Infestation in 2010 was a pretty strong album. And they seem to have a revived lineup, getting Carlos Cavazo in there, but for whatever reason, it just didn't last. And Piercy's going out doing the songs himself, and it's just yeah, you have to wonder what it is that reaches back so far that makes people just not want to not worth getting on a bus with or putting it together, because yeah, they should be reaping the benefits of the 80s being this. People look back on it, it's not like in the 90s. I mean, we lived through the 90s, it was so uncool, right?
Mhm.
But
Well,
they're
yeah, because
past
I
that.
think, yeah, because now with things like Spotify and things like that, I think people have maybe finally wised up to realizing that every genre has their good bands and bad bands, and
Right.
good songs, bad songs. So you can't really say all of one genre was awful or bad, or I mean, we've all done things in the past that we either regret, like fashion wise or look wise or whatever. So, but yeah, I mean, now with Spotify, I think people with playlists, you can, take a little bit of Rat, take a little bit of Soundgarden, take a little bit of Jimi Hendrix, take a little bit of the Bee Gees. You can take a little bit of everything, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's not quite as, the lines in the sand aren't as thick as they were in the 90s. It was definitely like anything that was considered hair metal was just off the table altogether in terms of popularity. But
Mhm.
so Rat remains, a band that people continue to listen to and continue to enjoy their music. So I think it's great that, there's a book out now that basically sums it all up. And, unless something changes, that's going to be how it is. You ever seen Rat live, Greg?
I sadly never did because I started going to regular arena shows about 87-ish was I was old enough to start going. And at that point, Rat maybe only played my area in an arena two or three more times. And I mean, I probably should have gone to it would have been cool to see them play Madison Square Garden because from what the reviews and everything in the book from people back then all say that that was a fantastic show. So that would have been a good one to see. So yeah, I kind of missed that. And I mean, also at the time I was so young, I didn't have that much money to spend money on all these tickets, at the time. But yeah, looking back, I would have absolutely liked to have seen Rat in 1987. I think 1987, instead, I saw the David Lee Roth Eat 'em and Smile tour, and that's the only one I could think of in 1987 for some reason. I should have gone to see Motley Crue on the Girls, Girls, Girls tour, but I didn't have the money. So,
Yeah, it's interesting when you look back and look at old concert dates because I didn't start going to shows till '93, and Rat were
mhm,
long over by then.
right.
Also, Rat have never ever played. I live in Eastern Canada, so Rat have never played around here. The closest I think that they've ever played would be Portland, Maine, and they would
Okay.
have played there in. I don't know if they. I know they played there in '85. I don't know if they would have played. They probably played there on the Dancing Undercover tour too, but probably not Reach for the Sky because it just as the album sales shrunk, the markets shrunk where they would play. They had to go where the fans were. So,
Sure.
yeah, it's just one of those things. But you look back at these old concerts that happened, and it's like, yeah, not everybody had that even though ticket prices when you look back on them were so cheap,
Hmm.
it's all relative, right? At the time,
Yeah.
it's like, well, do I go to the show or do I do this? You had to
Right.
choose.
Hmm.
Um, so, World Infestation, the Rat Story by Greg Prato. Go get it. Greg, what else have you got going on? I'll give you the floor here. What are you working on now?
Well, I mean, I'm always writing and always doing books. I'll just quickly show you some of my latest books. So this one I put out last year. It's called 50 Rock Lists and Surprise Twists. And like the book says, it's a compilation of things such as the greatest Queen songs that Freddie Mercury did not sing, and the top 10 most underrated Kiss album tracks, and the top 10 times a opener outshined the headliner, and things like that. And a bunch of other books. One I'll just hold up quickly. What do you think of Mark Lanigan? Are you a fan of Mark Lanigan? Are you familiar with him at all?
I Screaming Trees. Yeah, it's
Right.
not really my thing, but I know who he
Okay.
is. Yeah.
Because I was a admirer of Mark Lanigan, and sadly, after he passed, I did a deep dive, and he was an amazing artist. His solo material, I kind of knew. Like what you just said, I really knew him primarily through Screaming Trees, but after I did that book, listening to his solo material, he's become one of my favorite vocalists of all time, up there with Freddie Mercury, Bon Scott, Chris Cornell. Like though he similar to what I was saying about Stephen Pearcy, you hear Mark Lanigan sing for a few seconds, you know exactly who it is, and he had a very unique style, great lyricist, and yeah, he's a artist. If you're not familiar with him, I would recommend you check out his solo material. Fantastic.
Yeah, when the grunge alt rock thing happened, I was clinging desperately to. I was still listening to Winger and Cinderella
Oh yeah.
and stuff like that. So I was flying the flag for that stuff, and unpopularly so, I might add. One more question I meant to ask you about the Rat book, Greg,
Sure.
was there anybody in the Rat camp or associated with, other than of course Robin, that you wanted to talk to that weren't able to?
Well, the thing is, I actually interviewed them all. What it was these the interviews that I did, the quotes. I already asked them all the questions that covered their whole entire career with either the classic rock feature or these recent interviews. And also, like I said, I interviewed Warren for a earlier book. So I mean, even if I got them on the phone again, I'd be asking them the same questions and probably getting the same answers. So I just figured I already had it all mapped out there in front of me. It was just a matter then of just getting the quotes to fit where it goes in the story. And then besides that, like I said, I also got a lot of forgotten quotes in the past. I also got Mitch's interview with Robin, and I did all new. I did several all new interviews that are exclusive for this book with Bunny Carlos from Cheap Trick. I do Don Jameson of That Metal Show, and also Ricky Rackman, who also has some pretty good stories about memories of hanging out with Ratt during the Cat House days. He used to, besides being the MTV Headbangers Ball host, he co-owned a very popular rock club in LA called the Cat House with Tammy Down from the band Faster
Yeah.
Pussycat. And yeah, one thing that on Amazon, this book is so far getting very good feedback, and something someone said which I liked a lot. They said by reading this book, it's like a time capsule back to the 80s. And that's kind of what I was trying to do with this book too, is to try to recreate the vibe of what it was like, back then. So it was definitely good to see that.
So is that the easiest way to get the book? That's how I got mine, on Amazon.
Amazon. And, one more book I'll show you. I did two books about a year ago. It was a volume one and volume two. It's A+ albums, the stories behind 50 rock classics, volume one, 1970 to 1982. And this one is 1982 to 2000. And I go a lot of there's expected books, but I also try to balance it with also expected albums, but then there's unexpected albums I tried to include in this, such as Blue Oyster Cult's first album. I think that's a overlooked masterpiece. Then forwarding into the 90s, an album called Spilt Milk by the band Jellyfish. I don't think it really gets the credit. And a lot of, metal, there's funk, there's all different styles of music in that. So I think I see all the CDs and tapes and records behind you. There's definitely a lot of the albums I'm sure you have in those two books.
Right on. Yeah. So Greg, people follow. You're on Instagram. You're on Facebook. Where can people get in touch with you?
Twitter is probably the best because I write a lot for websites and magazines. I always post my latest interviews on my Twitter page, which is or at X, whatever it's called now. I don't know if people call it Twitter or X anymore, but it's a Greg Prato Writer. So if you go to twitter.com/Greg Prato Writer, I'm always posting my latest interviews. Like today, I just interviewed Buck Dharma from Blue Oyster Cult, who I just mentioned. I
Awesome.
just posted a brand new interview with him, and I have upcoming interviews that are going to come up with the guitarist from Dragon Force, and also two members from the band Judas Priest as well. I'm going to be posting up there soon. So yeah, always check out Twitter.
Awesome. So Ratt fans, do not hesitate to pick up World Infestation, the RATT Story. It's easy to spot. It's got that dancing undercover tribute of the cover. Greg Prato, thank you very much, Greg, for taking a little time out and speaking with me.
Great. Thanks for having me.
We will talk to you later. And thanks, everybody, for watching this episode of Tim's Vinyl Confessions. Go crank up some Ratt and Roll.